extraterrestrial life. Our audience finally know and love Dan Winter well, but I think that a review of his extensive experience is warranted, as his background is as multifaceted as his viewpoint, and is only courtesy of me having a long-standing friendship with his better half that he appears on my screen, because he's a man who is way above my pay grade, but I do regard him as a beloved friend of many years. But understand about Dan that he's got an extraordinary background. After graduating with honors from the University of Detroit, he pursued graduate studies in psychophysiology and the origin of languages. And he's worked as a systems analyst with IBM, an industrial metallurgist, and a crystallographer. He's undertaken many diverse studies, from quantum physics to modeling at the MIT Space Lab, to developing the early biofeedback prototype equipment as Dr. Albert Axe's protege. And Dan draws on many sources, including science, mythology, popular culture, and even channeled information, looking for ideas always about the deep connectedness of all things and how the profound nature of our oneness can be approached from architecture, art, math, biology, electronics, computers, or myth. Please welcome Robert Potter. Good to see you, sir.
It's a pleasure to be here today, Sacha. It's an honor to be here with these esteemed guests and to share the information and the truth that we're not alone, never have been alone, and never will be alone.
Let me just bring the other guests in. Robert, just hang on one second there. Dan, good to see you. You'll need to unmute there, Dan. Forgive me. Happy to see you. Dan, you might want to unmute your microphone. He's not as clever as I made out, folks.
No, I was just saying my beard's a little longer, and my hair's too long.
Very good. Well, good to see you there, Dan. Let me bring on the maestro himself, Michael Sala. So happy to see you.
Pleasure to meet you, Sacha.
Delightful. So, gents, let's begin. Thank you for joining us today. Truly delighted. And I know the audience are thrilled. We have a very big audience looking in. My questions are more or less penned out here, but I know I'm likely to go off on tangents. Dan, your immediate reflections on what Michael just said.
Well, Michael and I are in agreement. We're also good friends with Elena Danaan, and who has written about the Cedars, which is about the return of Enki, actually, and Thoth, the nine, as it were. And Elena and others have made a very useful comment about the physics of the genetic modification of what you call the medical stabbing, which is specifically that, it's not really proven that it's a graphene, but it's at least a graphene emulet. And what's behind that is a super dielectric material. The super dielectric material, Elena says, and I think she's probably right, that it relates to just what Michael was speaking about, which is a blood and genetic modification that allows one specific thing, actually, more compatibility with communication with, in this case, what Elena calls the Nebu or gray, the hive mind. And notably, there's also a Draco Uru queen, Mag, also. Matrix of Agni, Mag, Migdal, had to do with the fact that the story Magda related to the fact that that bloodline was literally Thoth, as in the case of Thothmosis, who is literally the returning Cedars and the Nine, who was the royal blood of Egypt, named Thothmosis, which was a genetic experiment of Enki Thoth, clearly. And so at this point, using humans as a kind of chimera to make a spike protein, which itself is a smoking gun, they said it's not dangerous. In fact, it's fatal. We have a major database on that. But what's behind that is the installation of a super dielectric material in the blood that permits communication with what is in effect the Nebu hive mind. So recently, when the returning Galactic Federation booted most of the Nebu and Gray out of here, I think Elena's right and Alex Collier agrees. And it's only an extension of what Anton Parks said about Enki, except bringing Enki into the future, as Elena has done nicely. And so when they got the Nebu and the Grays out of here, well, they took the tick out of the arm, but it left the stuff in the blood. And the stuff in the blood specifically Well, here's an indicator. Most of the psychics, many very, very intelligent people, see literally that the aura detaches from the body. You become literally beside yourself, is one of the major byproducts of the vax, unfortunately. And that detachment of the aura has to do with what Michael was just speaking about, and what Elena Denon refers to as the return of the grail in the blood, related to what Michael refers to as the perfect Adamic. And this will be my conclusion for the segment, that the big picture here is tens of thousands of humanoid races in this galactic sector alone. What do we have to be proud of? It's actually quite simple. That what they call the grail in the blood is the physics, and I do mean the physics, of the ability of the blood to implode in the presence of bliss, what I call fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood, our article about the ET history. The physics of the ability to get dense implosive compression in the blood, sometimes called bliss, sometimes called ensoulment, sometimes called the L as in Elohim, which is the translation of vorticity from transverse to longitudinal, rainbow light body vril, lots of names for that longitudinal coherence. But we know and can prove that that's what enables lucid dreaming, because we can make that field, and that's what enables people to get through death. And that is literally, electrically, precisely what is meant by having a soul. So when in fact we're talking about, who's in the next dimension, what we mean electrically, and has anyone else answered this question? What we mean electrically when we said, are you in the next dimension, is when the coherence of your aura can embed in a longer wave array, a longitudinal array, sometimes called heaven or planes of Saron, which is where you go when you die in the dreaming tracks. So, short answer, the coherence of the blood that is interfered with by the vaccine, literally the ability to have a soul, is the currency of the galaxy. Look, the thing that's actually valuable, tens of thousands of humanoid species are doing trade every day. But what's the most valuable thing they trade in? It is genetic material, and it's one kind of genetic material. When the Dracos it was actually the Greys mostly did the abductions after the wrong treaty with Eisenhower, 90% of the people that were abducted had some indigenous blood. Hint, walked barefoot on the land and could lucid dream.
Yeah.
Why did they need that? They needed the ones who could make that kind of coherence in the blood, because that magical implosion in blood is the currency of the galaxy. So if we can raise a kid to have enough bliss to lucid dream, hint, where's the value here?
Very good. That's it. There's a Disney film in there somewhere, Dan. That's a joke, guys. Let me introduce Rob Potter in at this point. And Rob, I have to ask you, as a face-to-face, I think I'm right in saying the only face-to-face contactee on a recent one, which seems to be pretty high res and apparently authentic. In any event, thank you for that. Dan, your reflections on the same question. Governments, the end of government, the beginning of one world government. Where are we at, as you see it?
Well, I think it might be appropriate to sort a little on the history in that regard. Everybody kind of knows that when Eisenhower got sucked into the wrong treaty, it was effectively the Nebu, the Greys, that did the abduction. But few people know that the U.S. Navy was the one to resist the longest, the quote-unquote suicide of Admiral Bourda is an example. But then later, when the William Thompson is talking in detail about how the U.S. Navy led, the Earth fleet to resist the Nazis, they had finally gotten that Mercury vortex technology working in the U.S. as well as the German Nazis. And by the way, that story, we're going to work on in detail the physics behind that Mercury vortex and how it worked in the show this coming Monday. I'm going to be recording with Michael Sala, actually, and really try to put the physics together of the vortex technology. But the context here, you're asking about the government, is that clearly a part of the U.S. government has been actively collaborating with the Galactic Federation for a fair number of years now, and that's becoming more and more public. Witness Randy Kramer. And the other side of that story is if you look at, you're talking about the Russians here, you know, all of the Pleiadian sources, even the ones that I think are not to be trusted, like Swaru and the Pleiadians, they all agree the bloodline is Russian, and all the pictures come from Russia. and they even said, "Oh well, Swaru gave the guns to Putin when the major Tegotan fleet left." Well, I think there's a deeper part of that story, and that story is the fact that I think Elena Danaan is right, and that most of the Greys and Dracos did get booted out of here, the solar system, a few years ago. However, as you said, the remnant families remain. And so I think much more sorting is necessary for the stories like with Robert, etc. That what we now know, thanks to Elena, is the Anunnaki were actually not Draco or reptilian. They were a branch of the tall white and humanoid and the tall grays and humanoids. So we know more about the bloodline of the Anunnaki, and how Marduk fit in there was Enlil took over on the parasitic side of the Anunnaki, but Enki at that time was the genetic engineer, and he had seeds of the Cedar races and Thoth, and that's who's back as the Intergalactic Federation witness Elena Danaan's The Cedars. And that is the good news. And what that means is that there is a serious solution to, for example, the black goo problem. The black goo problem was infected the lower echelons of the Draco. The higher echelons are called the Siakar, more accurately, and they do have a hive queen. And William Nutter, aka Johann Fritz, was one of the few humans to meet the hive queen of the white Draco personally. And the difference in the blood chemistry between the white Draco and the red Draco, which is the white versus red phosphorus in their blood, where the word Rothschild red shield actually comes from, is Draco. So we need to sort those stories, because the Draco never had the same agenda as the Greys or the Anunnaki, and that was a very different. What we call the Orion Wars was a war with the Greys and the Nebu. And the more recent infestation with the Draco is a separate infestation. So as we learn more about how those hive mind cultures tried to parasite this Earth, we're going to learn the upstart of that story, which is, if you have kids, if you make kids who can have enough bliss to lucid dream, they get leverage over the parasites, because if there's implosion in the aura, what can be called bliss or fusion in the blood or rainbow light body, lots of names for it. If there's implosion in the aura, it creates the plasma force, which is implosive, which toasts all parasites. So literally, if you're able to sustain your bliss, you can call your sovereignty, and parasites are toasted.
Fascinating. Wow. Good stuff. I want to jump back to Michael momentarily. And put another question here. Why do you believe in candidate?
Well, Soros is Hungarian. The root of the term Hungary is An-Ag Uru. Ag is male dragon. Uru means ancient Draco blood. And going back to that split when Akhenaten changed his name to Moses and founded the Essenes, Atun was the name for Enki's side of the family, which actually is Osiris, sun god, who Atun was. And who he had to run for his life from was the bankers, which is Amun, which is Enlil's side of the family, related to your other Anunnaki bad guys. So that split in the family, Enki and Enlil, is playing out today. That's true. Now, the personality side of this, I will admit, is not my expertise, actually, with those personalities. I tend to think that standing in judgment may not be very helpful. What I have focused on is the physics and actually electrical engineering of what Michael Salek calls the Star Trek future. And actually, next week, I'm doing a program with Michael, after having done about 5 with Elena Danaan, really on the electrical engineering of the Star Trek future. We're going to start with, the real physics of what a warp propulsion versus impulse power is. And then we will understand exactly what a med bed is, rejuvenation technology. And ultimately, what a stargate and portal is. It is fascinating here that when the ancients said that the hollow metal moon had frequency generators in there to amplify the Van Allen belts because they couldn't get through without nuking their way through, and that was the quarantine. Well, later, how did the bad guys, the Nebu Draco Greys, get away? They developed Stargate's portals. Now, the letters used to make the Stargate movie, or the Ophanium-Enochian, which is actually the plasma physics of hypercube implosion. It turns out if you take our Therify.net longitudinal generator, which measurably triggers lucid dreaming, and you up the amperage, we recently measured Jean-Charles Moyen's brainwaves when his lucid dream became a portal, and he came back with sand between his toes with witnesses, and we know exactly what a portal, a Stargate is, and that was the way out of here, literally transcendence. So it does get back to the fact that, yes, we have a lot of personalities here who do appear to have lost their soul. But when we can teach engineers and universities and governments what a soul is, that will, which is, by the way, longitudinal coherence. It's very, very specific, not just predicting who can lucid dream and who will take memory through death, but who can use a portal with that kind of genetic coherence. So when we can teach universities and governments what a soul is, on that day, spiritual decisions will then become possible. We will know what fractionates soul, like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and vaccines, because we will know exactly what kind of DNA coherence can allow our children that kind of transcendence. So that's my focus on the physics of it.
Fantastic. So there you go, folks. Soul equals longitudinal coherence. You heard it here.
Yes.
Michael, what is the significance of the James Webb Space Telescope? Beautifully segued, because my closing question here in the last few minutes was, reflections or thoughts on where we're heading imminently. So let me just put that question. Thank you for answering that preemptively, Robert. And Dan, let me ask the same to you. How are you feeling in your blood, your bones, and the marrow of your bones about where we stand as Christed beings, and what I'm not going to ask you what the future holds, because the future doesn't exist, but what do you see unfolding as the great revelation in the time ahead?
Well, the story of the Star Trek future kind of began when Star Trek authors were taught by Phyllis Schlemmer, who was taught by Andrea Puharich, who was my good friend, when which then became the book Only Planet of Choice, in which it was announced that the returning 9 was in fact the Cedars. At that time, they called it Atun. Today, it is Elena Danan's book, The Cedars, who is in the orbit of Jupiter at Ganymede, actually. And when Thoth announced, oh, yes, we're back. you know what Thoth's logo is? It's a caduceus, which in today's physics is called phase conjugation, actually, which is how you make implosion and fusion in blood. So, yes, you can rotate a conjugator like fullerene and make propulsion and energy, which, our carbon nano team can get out of the solar system in days. It doesn't take them years like it does NASA. Once you know how a rotating conjugator, it's sort of like Keshe's car floating on spinning ping pong balls, but you actually have to make nanomaterials 99% pure. But when you know how to rotate a conjugator, you actually know how to implode, and that's called the gravity wave. That's what longitudinal EMF is, the stuff of gravity waves as Bearden defined by equation. So our future is to understand that being able to implode and create longitudinal plasma projection, the kind of coherence that takes you into a lucid dream, that becomes a portal and is the only way through death and the only physics of action at a distance, which Einstein incorrectly called spooky, and the only physics of the rejuvenation, the medbed. It starts with knowing the origin of all centripetal and negentropic forces, which is the caduceus of Hermes, who is now back. So I think once we can teach the average intelligent person on the street of why anything is centripetal and therefore negentropic, hint, focused human attention causes electric fields to become centripetal. That's been measured. And the origin of centripetal force is the difference between a live seed and a dead seed. It's the origin of life, Hermes caduceus. So once we begin to understand those things, that is our future.
Beautiful. I'm typical, Dan. I mean, I ask you vision for the future and you give me a fucking equation, but I get it. And I love it. Thank you. Michael, in closing, your reflections